You're listening to the Legal Talk Network.
Hello, I'm Bob Ambrogi.
And I'm Monica Bay.
We've been writing about law and technology for more than 30 years.
That's right. During that time, we've witnessed many changes and innovations.
Technology is improving the practice of law, helping lawyers deliver their services faster and cheaper.
Which benefits not only lawyers and their clients, but everyone.
And moves us closer to the goal of access to justice for all.
Tune in every month as we explore the new legal technology and the people behind the tech
here on Law Technology Now.
Hello, this is Dan Linna. Welcome to Law Technology Now on the Legal Talk Network. My guest today is David Curle, Director of Enterprise Content at Thomson Reuters Legal Executive Institute. David provides research and thought leadership around the competitive environment and the changing legal services industry. David, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Dan. Nice to be here.
Well, before we get started, we want to thank our sponsors. First, welcome to our new sponsor, HeadNote. HeadNote helps lawyers get paid faster with their compliant e-payments and accounts receivables automation platform. To learn how to get paid quicker and more efficiently, visit them at headnote.com. That's headnote.com. So David, thanks again for joining us today. Can you just start by telling us a little bit about your role at Thomson Reuters?
Sure. The Legal Executive Institute, first of all, is a group within Thomson Reuters that tries to help our customers understand the changing environment that they're working in. My particular focus is on technology and innovation, but we have other folks on our team that do a lot of research around law firm performance, for example, issues like diversity and inclusion and talent development in the industry and that sort of thing. But as I said, I focus specifically on technology and innovation, so we're kind of in the same space.
Okay. Yeah, great. Well, let's just jump right in. And I think defining innovation is interesting. Some people have been saying that innovation's become a meaningless buzzword and that we should stop using that word. I mean, I disagree. I really think it's critical that we better define what do we mean when we say innovation in the legal industry. And what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I don't think it's very helpful to ban words. It's better to just use them better, maybe. But I think you're right. We could have a better definition. One thing that our head of R&D, Khalid Al-Kofai, says is that he doesn't like the word innovation because a lot of people associate it with sort of aimless experimentation or people sort of sitting around waiting for inspiration for new ideas, when in fact, he believes that innovation really requires a lot of discipline and accountability, and would prefer to sort of see it that way. So, in terms of defining it, maybe Khalid would say innovation is the discipline of finding new ways to do things, with the emphasis on discipline as well as the innovation part. And the other part of it is that I think it's important to remember that innovation isn't just about technology. In the legal services industry, there's room for innovative business models, innovative, new product design, new sort of staffing models, resourcing models, all kinds of parts and moving parts in the industry can be innovated around. It's not just about kind of technology and IT.
Well, and I know you spend a lot of time looking across the whole industry. And, it used to be that we were really just focused on the law firms, and then the law firms in the legal departments. And now we started to talk about alternative legal services providers and the big four. I mean, how do you kind of conceptualize, can we be thinking about what this space looks like? How would you describe it?
Well, you're right in that there seems to be sort of new players, new entities in the industry now, and also sort of new types of roles. And I think we're going to continue to see more fragmentation along those lines, frankly. I mean, there's the alternative legal service providers have, been around for a long time now. They're an established part of the industry. They're not going away. They're specializing and focusing on certain things and certain services. There's likely to be sort of even more sort of niche-oriented players that do, even a narrower range of things, but just do it all the time and do it well. And then, on the client side, the corporate side, you see a lot of change there in the rise of the legal operations thinking, and they're playing a much bigger role, I think, than they used to in the innovation side of the industry.
Well, when you talk about innovation in, let's start at the two kind of traditional places we'd most frequently look, legal departments and law firms. What kind of things are you seeing there? What kind of differences are you seeing in legal departments versus law firms?
I think one difference is that a challenge that law firms have is kind of distinguishing themselves, differentiating themselves from other law firms. And quite frankly, until recently, most law firms offered the same set of services, had the same set of practice areas. There were a lot of sort of generalist firms. I think they are feeling the pressure to show innovation in different ways, and to come up with innovation programs, appointing chief innovation officers. There's a lot of activity. It's not clear that all that activity is leading to sort of value for clients all the time, but I think there is more and more, and I see more evidence of it all the time. On the client side or the corporate side, it's a lower profile type of innovation, but it's just as important. Legal operations professionals are really remaking some of the ways that legal problems are approached in-house. And that's a sort of a quieter form of innovation that's gone on for some time now.
Well, David, you mentioned that there's pressure on law firms, and it's interesting because there sometimes kind of seems to be mixed messages about what's happening at law firms. Folks like Richard Susskind talk about the difficulty of telling a room full of millionaires that their business model is wrong. And even the AmLaw data from a high level seems to suggest that firms, part of the takeaway was the idea that firms had their best year ever. Although I spoke with Nick and Gina from ALM a couple of weeks ago, and there's more to the story than that. But when you say there's pressure on firms, like how would you describe more like where that's coming from and what really kind of that means?
Well, I think there is pressure in the financial pressure or demand side pressure on firms, sort of in the middle. I think the AmLaw data reflects that, and our data, our peer monitor data, kind of shows the same thing too. Is that there is a top level of firms that seem to be immune to everything, and they're going gangbusters, and then there's sort of the middle layers of the AmLaw 200 that are not growing as well. And if you think of the whole industry over the past 10, 11 years since the downturn, it really has been flat. And I think not going down is not a great, not the best measure. I mean, if you're flat, you're sometimes standing still. So I think there is some financial pressure, but there's also, I think, more just, a lot of it is just a competitive pressure, firms wanting to define themselves and stake out a differentiation in technology and innovation.
And I think this is another interesting thing that we hear when we look at innovation. And I'm seeing more and more indications that even this top level of the market, maybe they are immune in some ways. But based on some of the things I'm seeing, I'm certainly seeing innovation in some of what we'd call the top firms. Mm-hmm. I mean, how would you describe like what maybe some of those top firms are doing?
Yeah, I have to say that. I mean, it's not like nothing's happening. It's not that it's all show. I mean, there are firms where you see a pretty good, healthy adoption of some of the new technologies offered by vendors. You see some of the internal innovation programs, leading to rethinking of how processes are handled. I think one thing that you have to remember is a lot of times this stuff is incremental. It's not necessarily about some big bang that's going to change a business overnight. But it's more about fixing processes, introducing some technology here and there, and approaching business problems in different ways. So it's not always high profile stuff. It may be fairly niche oriented, but it does have an effect on clients.
Yeah. Well, that's a great point, and that's something that's come through with quite a few of my guests, is just talking that about innovating for the long haul and you're saying your colleagues are talking about the discipline of innovation, mm-hmm. and a lot of those things may not be so apparent on the outside, and it's more of investments that are going to pay dividends longer term, things like that. Mm-hmm. Well, what about if we really kind of look at this from the perspective of in-house counsel, and you get a lot of opportunities to talk with folks inside of legal departments, and when they say that they want their lawyers and law firms to innovate, what do you think it is that they want?
More stuff, faster and cheaper. They're like any customer in that sense. maybe what they want that they haven't gotten in the past is mostly around a flexibility or a willingness to do things differently, particularly around things like pricing and structuring, budgeting various matters and projects. And I think the dynamics are changing in the industry where the client used to order the work. The lawyers at the firm would go off and do it and bring it back. And now I think there's much more expectations around collaboration. Like how do we roll up our sleeves and work on this together? The firm lawyers and the in-house lawyers. How do we find a process that works better, whether that's within the law firm or within the client? So I think that's a source of a little bit of pressure and demand is let's collaborate more on this stuff.
Can you give any examples kind of that, or even just kind of the beginning stages of what that collaboration might look like? Or
we had a Legal Executive Institute event yesterday here in Chicago called Augment, and it was kind of focused around artificial intelligence for the most part. And one of the big issues had to do with, before you get to using AI, before you can turn an algorithm loose on a bunch of data, you have to have the data in good shape. You have to know that it's accurate. You have to know you'll have continuous access to it, so rights to the data of different kinds. And that's one area where I think I do see a lot of collaboration. There were a number of examples in that conference of law firms using their legal expertise to sort of advise on the processes around data governance that the client can use. But then there's also, the sort of technical aspect of data governance. How do you maintain access to the data? How do you maintain all the APIs that let it work together and stuff like that? So I think those, I guess, would be some examples that I was hearing yesterday.
Okay. It's interesting that the comment about customers, right, and what customers are expecting in other verticals, and I see a lot more discussion about that we need to stop referring to clients as clients and thinking about them as customers and kind of thinking, with this broader perspective. I think this kind of touches on something where in the legal industry, my experience as a practicing lawyer, and then even what I see frequently when I speak and talk to others, is that the reluctance of lawyers to get feedback from clients, and to actually listen to what they're asking for. And how much of that is kind of what is maybe critical to the whole idea of, are enough lawyers really asking this question of their clients?
Yeah, I think that's a big part of the challenge. I don't want to just repeat stereotypes about lawyers and how they're anti-technology or whatnot, but I do think there's a distance particularly between firm lawyers and not so much the in-house lawyers, but the business, people running the businesses at the clients, and their needs and their expectations. Maybe there's a bit of a disconnect. I think that's certainly one of the areas where the industry could do better.
Yeah. Well, so related to that, I have kind of this idea that lawyers tend to not ask the clients how we're doing. Especially if the client paid the bill. It's like, well, why would we go back and ask any questions? It's like, just move on and don't even get them thinking about whether we did a good job or how we might improve. And of course, that creates problems if you're not getting that feedback and thinking about how to improve, asking the questions. On the other hand, I think back to the quote that was attributed to Henry Ford, this idea like, if I'd asked the customers what they want, they would have said faster horses, which, I think really kind of means that you as a service provider, the idea of having empathy for the client, it's like understanding their problems and maybe delivering a solution they hadn't even conceived of. Do you think there are opportunities in legal for us to really be thinking that way? Or
Absolutely. I think the law firms have been delivering the same kind of horses for all these years, and it's if you think of yourself as being in the horse business, it's hard to change. And so I think maybe to anticipate one of your other questions here, that's partly what I think is behind the rise of alternative legal services providers, is this desire to say, okay, look, here's a different way to deliver this service. A law firm could do it, but we can do it differently and maybe cheaper and faster. So there is a sense that, that's evidence of that disconnect in filling the sort of underlying needs of the clients. Maybe not the immediate ask, which is, hey, put out this fire or solve this problem, and finding a way to sort of get underneath the issue, get to the business problem, that the client is grappling with and try to find a solution for that that's maybe not just the traditional approach.
Well, and you mentioned alternative legal service providers, and a really huge story that we all heard about recently was that EY acquiring Thomson Reuters Managed Services, previously known as Pangea 3. What are you seeing as the role of, I mean, you don't necessarily have to predict the future, but even just like you're on the ground here, what are you seeing, like the way alternative legal services providers are impacting the marketplace now, today?
I think you'll see, continue to see a lot of experimentation. So you're right, it is really hard to predict. But I think, as I said, these alternatives have been around for quite a while now. Many of them are quite successful and large and growing. We did our research on the ALSP market and found them growing at 10.8% on a cumulative annual rate. And that's pretty good compared with the rest of the legal industry. As far as the sort of size and shape of it in the future, I think there's, as I kind of said before, I think there's going to be continue to see new models in that space, maybe some specialization, and continued sort of fragmentation of the space. But then also, one of the things we've found in some of our research is that more and more, not just corporate clients, but law firms are turning to alternative providers really for access to technology, because they realize they can partner with somebody who knows the technology, who has staff that knows the technology inside and out, and they can access kind of on a just-in-time or on-demand basis through an ALSP. So I think that's increasingly going to be part of the mix here, is that ALSPs can become a conduit for delivery of some of the technology that's maybe not the stuff that's used every day, but that can be useful, on a matter-by-matter basis.
Yeah, that's an interesting observation. And I mean, so much of this, there's a lot of experimentation going on, and it's way too early to predict with any sort of certainty, I think, how these things are all going to play out. I think one of the things that's interesting to me is that we've seen a handful of law firms who've actually developed technology that they've been able to do some pretty interesting things with to provide services directly to clients. Ackerman Data Law Center at Actuate Law now. Wilson Sonsini just launched this 650 product, an expert system facing clients for California Consumer Protection Act compliance. And the law firms are really reluctant to call themselves a technology company, which I kind of wish more of them would just really embrace that and go for it on that. But I don't know, what are you kind of seeing as far as like more law firms maybe getting in that space and
I think there's a lot of runway there for firms to, if they really want to go big on that. There's, lots of fields of law where the client is kind of just looking for a simple answer and can use a client-facing tool to work through the issues. There's great tools on the market now for, building expert systems. So yeah, I mean, I think that's an example of a case where law firms really have a competitive advantage there. I mean, they have their brand. If they're big in employment law like Littler, they can extend that brand by building the tools that serve that market, and they are. And so I think there's other areas of law that maybe could be served by that kind of tool.
Yeah. And any thoughts on other areas where or even just seeing things emerge? You think examples?
So I think one of the areas. I mean, you mentioned a couple examples already where a lot of tools that are used by startups or small companies. I think that's a really fertile ground. I think that that's not just kind of high tech startups, but even just sort of mom and pop businesses of different types have a really hard time affording legal counsel, and there's a lot of sort of basic things like articles of incorporation and various other sort of filings and documents that can be part of that kind of delivery service.
Yeah. And then some of the tools I just mentioned are really not focused even on, well, some of them will serve mom and pop type, but we see really large corporations very interested in some of those solutions, and more space there for solutions as well.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, look, anywhere there's a process, you can turn it into something maybe that can take it out of the hands of, the one-to-one contact with an attorney and put it into a system, and the beauty of it is if you're the law firm providing that kind of service, you have the service is backed by the firm's reputation. The lawyers are still there if there's a need to sort of, if there's an exception or a need to go outside the tool. So I agree. I think there's still a lot of runway there.
Yeah, and in fact, and of course, every one of these tools that I've seen has a process of vetting and figuring out if the user is if this is the right tool for them, and then if not, getting them to the lawyers. And the lawyers the law firms I've talked to are deploying these tools are, of course, recognizing that, some of these tools are tools you'll give away for nothing and it'll attract clients. Some of them will generate revenue directly, but then another part of the payoff is if you can get a portfolio of work coming in, there's almost always, I have a hard time thinking of a case there wouldn't be adjacent work in that field and that can come to the law firm.
Yeah, exactly. And there, of course, there's providers like LegalZoom and others that sort of do some of this. But I think, if you think of the sort of the branding opportunities for a law firm to say, don't go there, go to our law firm's system to do this, because it's backed, as I said, it's sort of backed by our firm, it's backed by our reputation. You have a specialist lawyer, able to help you with this if it's not, if something goes wrong or if it's not quite giving you the answer you need.
Yeah, I think I mentioned a few examples. Chapman Cutler's another interesting example of creating some software in-house to really improve the value proposition on creating closing binders and things like that for deals and the kind of thing. But it seems like there are a lot of opportunities across the marketplace for those things. Well, I want to transition to talking a little bit about data analytics and artificial intelligence, a couple of places where you do a lot of work. But before we do that, before we continue our interview with David Curle, we're going to take a quick break to hear a message from our sponsor.
Hey, law firms. Getting paid is fantastic, but dealing with accounts receivable is such a pain. What if there was a better way? Enter HeadNote, an industry-leading compliant e-payments and AR automation system. Their unique blend of features cuts through the noise and helps you get paid 70% faster. Skip the paper checks, spreadsheets, and awkward calls due to overdue clients. Get paid faster with less effort. Visit headnote.com for more information.
And we're back. Thank you for joining us. We're with David Curle, Director of Enterprise Content at Thomson Reuters Legal Executive Institute. David, I wanted to jump in, and you do a lot of work around data-driven practice, artificial intelligence, and some people talk about this like it's all one big area. I'm going to more and more conferences where people just refer to it all as AI. And I think like we were talking about defining innovation. In this area too, I like to try to break it down just even as a first cut, talking about metrics and small data, predictive analytics, automating tasks with artificial intelligence. Now, I don't know, is that a useful framework? How would you kind of describe what is a really enormous space so that we can better understand kind of what we're talking about across that area?
Yeah, I've absolutely experienced what you've experienced in terms of everybody just sort of throwing it all into one bag and calling it AI. If you go to a specialist conference like this one yesterday, there were a little finer distinctions drawn. And I think maybe you're right. I think there is kind of a spectrum of this stuff. First of all, it's all based on data. If you think of a data-driven practice, whether it's from the most basic stuff, your organization needs to measure and count stuff, and that can be just what measurements around what people are doing with their time, how much is spent on matters, how you're staffing things and what pay rates are and hourly rates and that sort of thing. So there's just lots of stuff to measure in a legal organization that, that's kind of step one, and it's not always been done very systematically in the past. And then I think the other sort of the next stage within that first sort of base level of competence you need is to have some sort of a governance strategy for data. We had a fascinating, for me anyway, panel at last year's Emerging Legal Technology Forum, which is a conference we have in Toronto every fall. And it was a panel of 3 or 4 heads of information governance within law firms. And all they talked about was how they wrangle the data that the firm has, because they have so much of it, but it's not very useful unless somebody's accountable for it. So there's somebody, for its accuracy and to make sure that it's always accessible and that it's always updated properly and what the update cycles are and all that. So I think at the basic level, that kind of role is becoming really important in a law firm, and I'm seeing more titles that indicate that the firm is giving it relatively more importance. A director of information governance or a chief information governance officer, even I think I've seen. So I think that's that sort of base level that's kind of the table stakes today.
Yeah. You mentioned the conference yesterday, and I should have followed up about this earlier, but the way you were describing earlier sounded like a really interesting conference. Can you just tell us a little bit more, like who was there and what the purpose of it was?
Yeah, yesterday was called Augment 2019, and the interesting thing about this conference was that it was an attempt to sort of bring people working in AI from both the legal industries and the tax and accounting industry, because as you Thomson Reuters serves the tax and accounting business. And we are seeing, kind of from a thought leadership point of view, that the two industries have a lot of common interests and a lot of common challenges. And so we thought it would be a good idea to sort of bring folks together from both sides to talk about the specific issues. But even there, you're kind of there to talk about artificial intelligence, but many of the conversations sort of turned to information governance and data integrity as kind of the foundation for all of this on both the tax and the legal side.
Yeah, that's really encouraging to hear. That's great to hear. I think just when we get out of the legal industry and start looking at, that's an obvious connection, right? Where we're seeing work being done, that there's a lot of relationships, but I think there's even so much to learn just looking at the healthcare industry, all these different industries that there's really a lot that I think we could learn from in our own industry.
Well, one observation I had, and maybe this is kind of mundane observation, that just because I haven't spent my life focusing so much on the tax side, but there's a different DNA maybe on the tax and accounting side, or the bigger audit firms anyway, where law firms tend to take the problem that comes in the door, and do the work, and then it's done. And I think there's more of a mentality on the tax and accounting side of, okay, here's a business problem, we have some expertise. Let's build a system for the client that will solve the problem on a permanent basis and fix the process, or whatever it might be. I think there's a little bit of a different mentality around that I think that was a interesting for me anyway to see, and maybe a new way that law firms can think about this stuff.
Yeah, well, I think that's a really, really great point. And it goes to a couple of things right off the top of my head. Like, well, first of all, people saying, well, so spreadsheets didn't decimate the accounting industry. Okay, well, but maybe they're thinking about the way they serve their clients a little bit differently. I think this also goes to, Jeff Carr and Pat Lamb and Nicole Auerbach talk about this a lot, about preventive law, trying to prevent problems before they ever happen. Mm-hmm. George Seidel and Helena Hapio have written a book about proactive law, thinking about that. And that's where, by the way, to turn this discussion back to data again, that's where I think law firms could provide a lot of expertise on the compliance side. How can a corporation use its data better to identify fraud that's going on within its company, or other illegal activities, or other problems that might arise in personnel issues and whatnot. So the corporation has a lot of data that they can mine for things like that, and the expertise of a law firm can sort of help along those lines. Yeah, sure. Compliance, thinking about, litigation, right? The best litigation is the one you never have.
Right,
and how do we really learn from each litigation on how we can maybe prevent one in the future?
Well, I think one of the things you learn with the litigation analytics products that are on the market, like ours, for example, but there are others, is all of a sudden there's a lot more transparency in the industry. You see that this type of litigation in this district is going to settle for or be have a judgment in this range, and over time you see it's pretty easy to figure out what some matters are worth, and you can avoid them at an earlier stage if you have that data about what the outcomes typically are.
Yeah. Well, and arguably even that is a narrow view of the world, right? Because that's kind of even just looking at, what do we do once there's a dispute, right? Yep. And I think this kind of ties back a little bit into metrics and small data. Mm-hmm. And I was kind of curious what you think are kind of table stakes, or what trends you see emerging. Because it occurs to me that we talk about the data we have few measures of quality. We don't, in the industry, we don't measure outcomes frequently. I mean, a huge difference. Not only do Netflix and Amazon have the data, but they've got feedback loops. They serve up their predictions and then they get immediate feedback on that. And so how can we kind of tap into more feedback loops? The litigation example I give, if we have data about litigation, that's great, but how come we don't know every time the business people maybe have some sort of a dispute on any level, or even look at the contract and think, man, I don't have what I need there to get what I need from the other party. If we're not feeding that sort of information back into our systems, then how can we get better results?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think the data or the sort of the data gathering or the focus of a lot of of data governance of efforts to date is kind of just on cleaning up the data. And most of it's not about feedback loops. Most of it's just about inputs. How many people are working on this? How many hours? What other expenses were there? That sort of thing. I think there's a long way to go in terms of being able to gather and master and leverage that kind of data that you're talking about. But I mean, there's certainly room for more of that.
Yeah. I think a related question to that is, my hypothesis is that we need more lawyers who understand all of this, including the mundane data stuff, because if they need to be asking what problems are we trying to solve, and then they can really be helpful on the help to figure out what data we could be collecting and building these models and so on. I mean, there's a lot of discussion about all of this. Should lawyers code? What do lawyers need to know about data? And I mean, what's kind of your latest thinking, I guess, about the way lawyers need to be engaged and what they need to understand?
Yeah, I mean, it feels like not the Wild West, but it's kind of a wide open discussion because, like you said, there's the whole question of okay, I agree with you that it would be great if more lawyers would have that sort of basic understanding about data. How do you get them there? Is it the kind of interdisciplinary program that you guys have here at Northwestern or others around the country at the different law schools? Is it maybe more taking some technologists and teaching them enough about law to be able to help assist with that kind of question and problem? So I think it's an open question. I think we're still in an age of experimentation. And then we also have a lot of, as you know, because you've been in academia for a while, it's like herding cats, to sort of change the way an academic institute works and organizes itself and reward systems and whatnot. So, there's a lot of work to do there. And I don't know, that kind of veered away from your question about what the lawyers need to know. But I mean, that's the context for that discussion, is that there's just a lot of people asking that same question, and nobody, I don't think, has found the right answer to that balance. Yeah,
well, and I would even just tie it back to this question how you were talking about accountants and others kind of viewing problems from a broader sense and seeing it as an opportunity, and of course, having the lawyers engage in that and seeing ways in which, I see a lot of the discussions at companies about ethics, for example. And often the lawyers are not present at those discussions. And how could the lawyers maybe lead in that area and think about regulation and law that we ought to have or that may be coming? And for just one example.
Well, I think, if you take a step back from legal and you look at the rest of academia in general, you see a lot of really interesting programs, interdisciplinary programs where, even at the undergraduate level, we're exposing students to data or to, hard sciences and mixing them with other disciplines. And it's odd that it's so hard to sort of get that kind of thinking into legal education, because it's happening everywhere else, and almost every industry is affected by this sort of need for people who can think in a sort of cross-disciplinary way.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and just I have colleagues at other schools, and I see other schools doing more and more of this. So we're seeing more of it. And then you even mentioned as well, educating people with STEM backgrounds, for example, in law. We have a program around that. We've got a program that Dan Rodriguez started that Leslie Oster leads here at Northwestern, our Master of Science in Law program. And in fact, those students are in our innovation lab and are working with the JD and LLM students who are working with computer science students to develop solutions. And so we're seeing that side of it happen in some schools as well.
Yep.
Well, so I brought up metrics and small data. I'm really interested too on the predictive analytics part of it. As a litigator, gosh, it was 10 years ago, and I first started teaching as an adjunct, and I was talking about calculating expected values, and there's this great article by Craig Glidden, who, when he was at ConocoPhillips, and he's now the general counsel at General Motors with Mark Victor, on creating decision trees for litigation. And gosh, I was just certain that we're going to see more lawyers doing this, especially when you see someone like Craig Glidden writing about it and encouraging people to do it. The uptake on it has been slower than I thought it would be. There are definitely some people doing stuff. I don't know, what are you seeing in the marketplace as far as where is their uptake and what might it look like, and maybe how might you suggest people even get started?
I think we're really at the beginning. I mean, it is still pretty early. I mean, products like litigation and analytics, Lex Machina, haven't been around that long, and they only do so much. I mean, they help identify, they help boil down what the data says, and help lawyers make an estimate or a prediction around certain things. And I think it's really early days, and I think like everything else, it's about kind of a systems thinking. It's sort of taking your thinking out of like, what are the merits of this specific case right in front of me, and taking a step back and sort of putting that dispute in context and taking in all the information to be able to make a reasonable prediction, or have the machine do a reasonable job at providing you with a prediction.
Yeah. Well, I think that an interesting question related to this. So I had Danielle Beneke from Baker McKenzie, and I'm sure you're familiar with their article because it was on the Legal Executive Institute. I like the way that she broke down what lawyers do and was talking about the AI empowered judgment and thinking about lawyers as providers of information and providers of labor as providers of prediction and then providers of judgment. And I think when you think about it, like how much of what lawyers do we call it judgment, that if you really thought about it, you'd say, wow, it's really prediction mostly, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, but when you get up into the prediction and the judgment parts, you're talking about the high-level work, the high-value work that lawyers do, which is great. I mean, that's where lawyers want to be, because some of the routine stuff is falling away or going to other providers. And I think you're right. You're just like, what I see as the judgment part is more when you get beyond predicting the matter in front of you and you go to the business problem, the underlying business problems that a client might face. And that's where the judgment comes in, the role as a trusted advisor, where the lawyer can see not only the legal issues, but the business issues. And that's where the real value lies for some of the people at the top of their practice.
Great point. Yeah. And I think that, I think this kind of goes back to some of the idea about the way that when we use these tools, the way that lawyers might redeploy and think about how to use their time. And it seems rarer and rarer to me that there are exceptions to this, but how many lawyers really know their client and their client's business in a way that they can function the way that you're talking about?
Right. Yeah. I mean, and it goes back again to education. The way you're trained, you're trained in it's an internal facing education in the sense that you're trained to understand the legal principles regardless of what the context is in many cases. And so I think a big part of that is, again, the education piece, to sort of think more systems thinking.
Yeah. Okay. So we've talked about small data and we talked about data analytics, and we're trying to make sense of what the data-driven law landscape looks like. Artificial intelligence. So I tend to try to think about rules-driven. We talked about expert system and data-driven. AI, on the other hand. How do you kind of see that landscape, and what do you see emerging there? Maybe some of the latest kind of trends that our audience might not be aware of.
Well, we talked about rule systems already, and like I said, I think there's still a lot of runway there for some new applications and a market for that. We've also talked about one area which I think is again going to be one of the biggest for AI, which is the prevention and compliance piece. Looking for and anticipating problems before they become problems, and that because that involves a lot of data and. That's what AI is all about. That's what AI is good at. A lot of AI isn't really frontline stuff. Maybe not all of it is going to be a client-facing tool or something that the lawyer can say, "Look, we used AI for this." But there's a lot of just simple classification of data that can leverage artificial intelligence. And going back to data governance and sort of cleaning up data. I know Dara Nevin. She was at the conference yesterday and talked a lot about this. How useful AI is for taking a set of messy data and making sense of it in an automated way, in a way that you could never do. You could never sort of manually tag thousands of documents, but you can use machines for that. So that's a kind of a sort of back office or almost a behind the scenes application for AI, but it's extremely useful when you need clean data. Another application is stuff like looking at timekeeping records, to classify how lawyers are spending their time. And there's automated systems out there that can sort of make predictions or not predictions, but classify the use of time based on certain indicators and inferences. So that's another sort of, in a way, behind the scenes application for AI.
Yeah. And that can't come soon enough for every lawyer in the industry.
Yeah, for sure. So I think, you asked me for kind of the big what's next, but I think in many ways, the what's next is a bunch of sort of small incremental improvements like that in the way firms manage their data, rather than some sort of big bang application that's going to sort of take over a particular class of legal work.
Yeah. So you kind of alluded to the difficulty of predicting the future, and I guess we've really kind of talked about this a little bit. But I'm going to ask my question anyway and push you a little bit more on this. But I think part of it is too that yes, it's hard to predict the future, but I think we must try to predict the future if we intend to prepare for the future. But even more so, I'd really like to push more of us in the legal industry, especially when we think about providing better access to legal information, access to justice, improving court systems, creating these value propositions by thinking more broadly, like we were just talking about, about how we can create the future. And so, where do you think maybe are some of the opportunities that with careful planning we could be creating the future? And in that sense, what might we see, 5 years or 10 years down the road, might you say?
Well, this may be a different answer than what you're anticipating or a different direction. But one thing that's kind of on top of my mind these days is I just had a call last week, I think it was, with Professor David Engstrom and Daniel Ho at Stanford. And they presented at a conference out there recently about a project that has to do with AI in the administrative state, in the regulatory state. So how are decisions being made, within the federal government that are leveraging big data and AI? And I think, you and I have been talking now for over half an hour, and we were kind of focused on the traditional legal services industry, law firms and their clients. And I think there's a lot of work to be done on the government side, on the courts and in public administration, where there could be extremely valuable and effective uses of AI. When you think of the amounts of data that government has, and how it could be, really change the way government works and the judiciary as well in many ways.
Yeah, there are tremendous opportunities. I've had a chance to talk with David about that a little bit and saw his panel at Codex. I was just talking with my colleague Emerson Tiller here at Northwestern about the huge opportunities in administrative law. You think about the millions of decisions made there.
So talk about fodder for predictions. I mean, that's, the predictions you can make about state court matters, there's a lot of them, but like you say, if you think of how many adjudications the Social Security Administration makes every day, and how many of them could be improved with a little better data management and a little AI and all that.
Yeah. So I like that answer. It may not have been responsive. I think that's I think it's the only thing I miss from. Well, I shouldn't say the only thing. I do miss plenty of things from practice. I enjoy this new career, but one thing I miss is being able to depose people and say that's not responsive. I'm sorry, but I guess I can't quite compel you to respond exactly to my questions here. So I did want to ask you about, David, also, you made the trip from Minnesota to Chicago a few weeks ago. You attended the law and technology demos that we did at Northwestern. Thomson Reuters sponsored sponsored, which we greatly appreciated. I talked about this innovation lab. We had computer science students and master science in law, and our JD and LLM students working on projects. We had challenges submitted by Mayor Brown, Reed Smith, Actuate Law, our Bloom Legal Clinic, and a public interest project. And I'd really like that to be a model for collaboration. We want to get more corporate legal departments, and we've got legal aid organizations involved too. But we had diverse interdisciplinary teams really working as teams. They built actual working prototypes, did live public demos of those projects. I may be drinking my own Kool-Aid here a little too much, but what do you think? Is that another way the academy can get engaged in this space?
I think absolutely. I love events like that. I get really jazzed by the energy you see, and especially since the clients, the partners out in the real world are there. They're watching the team that worked with them perform, and there's so many lessons in that. It doesn't matter if the specific app they're working on, or whatever the software or piece of technology they're working on. It doesn't matter if that has any legs beyond that evening. It's just the lessons that were learned along the way were all the things we've been talking about, right? It's like how to get lawyers to think about data and process and resource allocation and all these things that they might not normally get if they're sitting in a room, taking contracts class. So I do think some form of that, kind of working on real problems with real technology is extremely valuable and should be, I think it should be a part of everybody's curriculum.
Yeah. Well, you get no objections here.
Yeah.
So, we're really excited about the possibilities of continuing. And then just the idea of bringing together, I love trying the more events where we can have legal aid organizations and people from courts and the large law firms and corporations in the same room. It turns out, from what I see is that so many of the problems are much more the same than they are different. Yeah. I don't know what your experience is.
Yeah, in fact, another event that I was at recently was out at Georgetown.
Yeah.
They have the National Science Foundation sponsored a day-long, 3 days actually, parts of 3 days, conference on the application of data science to access to justice problems. And you'd be amazed at the sort of the diversity of organizations and initiatives represented there. But there are a lot of people in academia on the data science side working on real social problems and legal problems and social problems with legal aspects and all kinds of things. So there's just a ton of work to do, but part of there again, it all goes back to data, and that was kind of the focus of this conference. Is what do we need to do to put the data we have to work in service of access to justice?
Well, I think one of the themes of our discussion today has been kind of realizing the way in which the legal industry may be siloed, and there's silos inside of the legal industry. There's silos maybe inside of academia. So broadening our lens, I think when we have these conversations, we tend to be very U.S.-centric and probably do a whole show, multiple shows, just thinking about what's going on around the rest of the world. And I know you travel a lot. You're in London, you're in Singapore, China. But can you just? We're getting close to the end of our show here today. But if you, what do you think are some of the more noteworthy developments around the world as far as? I think part of it is we should be aware that firms and other organizations are pushing forward and legal tech startups on some of these tools in other places around the world, which will and has and continue to have an impact on the U.S. But I don't know, just what are some of your observations that we should be thinking about in jurisdictions outside of the U.S. here?
Well, you're right. There's a lot of activity going on, and I think if you want to look at one place that's worth keeping your eye on, it's Singapore. There's a government-led initiative there. It's sort of executed through this, for the most part, through the Singapore Academy of Law. They've developed a really comprehensive vision statement. So there's a whole document about how they want to transform the legal industry using technology. Not just the legal industry, but also government, aspects of legal services provision. And the unusual thing about it is the comprehensiveness. Like here in the United States or in various places in Europe or even Latin America, there are pockets of initiatives and forward-thinking people and new forms of legal education here and startup communities over there. But in Singapore, they sort of it's all brought together, and it's a centralized government-supported effort. And so I think to the extent that they succeed, there's a model for other countries around the world. And there's also, just to take that whole region as well, there's a recent report that came out, a state of legal innovation in Asia Pacific, and it took a look at, I think, 8 or 10 of the largest countries in the region and picked apart, like, what's going on? What are the differences? What are the similarities? And there were a lot of differences. It was very fascinating. In China, there's a lot of consumer-facing legal apps. You can solve almost any kind of problem on your phone these days there. In other countries like Australia, the innovation is mostly around business model. The sort of alternative legal services providers or new law companies are very big there. So, I think that region in particular is very hot and dynamic right now. But I mean, I know you just got off the phone this morning with a classroom in Spain. There's law schools like Bucerius in Germany that are doing a lot of interesting things. Yeah. So it really is has become kind of a worldwide phenomenon, and it's kind of decentralized, but also connected at the same time. I don't know. Is that your impression too?
Yeah. Well, I think it's really exciting. I mean, we have students coming here to Northwestern from a lot of different places who are very interested in this. I mean, we had students from Mexico and France and just a lot of other countries. Just in our LLM program, especially with some in the JD program, you mentioned the IE Madrid program and the Bucerius class. I mean, it's exciting to be there teaching just so many people from different jurisdictions. We're seeing the global interest and the global, not just interest, that sells it way short, right? It's like there's a lot of activity, a lot happening in these other jurisdictions.
Right. Yeah. So it's an exciting time, and I think people should be paying attention.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned a couple of reports, I think. How can people get their hands on those? Or maybe you'll tweet them out, and I should tell them they should be following you on Twitter. But
sure, I can tweet some links. There's some of our reports. The State of the Asia Pacific was one done by the Singapore Academy of Law. I'll have to go back on whatever we referenced here, and I can tweet out some links.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for joining us, David. Before we close, I want to make sure our guests, so that you should tell them your Twitter handle. Because all good legal innovators, they're on Twitter. I'm hoping. And how else might they get in contact with you? Yeah,
the Twitter handle is David Curle, all one word. So David Curle. And that's probably the best way to reach me if you want to just shoot me a message or if you want to just sort of follow what I'm up to.
Yeah. And then you've got a nice bio on the Legal Executive Institute with a list of your articles.
It's legalexecutiveinstitute.com is the URL. And actually, there's a lot of goodies there, including, all of our published reports will be there, information about our upcoming events. And then, of course, the main body of the site is our blog with lots of articles.
Well, thank you very much, David, for joining us today.
Great. It's been great, Dan.
This has been another edition of Law Technology Now on the Legal Talk Network. If you like what you've heard today, please rate us in Apple Podcasts. Join us next time for another edition of Law Technology Now. I'm Dan Linna, signing off.
If you'd like more information about what you've heard today, please visit LegalTalkNetwork.com. Subscribe via iTunes and RSS. Find us on Twitter and Facebook, or download our free Legal Talk Network app in Google Play and iTunes. The views expressed by the participants of this program are their own and do not represent the views of, nor are they endorsed by, Legal Talk Network, its officers, directors, employees, agents, representatives, shareholders, and subsidiaries. None of the content should be considered legal advice. As always, consult a lawyer.